My name is Christine Charles. I'm an extension educator. My topic area mainly is field crops, but my background is soil science, sustainable ag practices, regenerative agriculture. So today we'll be talking, and this will be more so a free-flowing conversation. I'll be giving some background and basics on basic soil science, and then how does this translate into our management, and how do we farm with soil health in mind, and all given these different soil characteristics. So, first topic of discussion is, what is a healthy soil? How would people define this is a healthy soil versus this is not a healthy soil? Yes?
Whether it's real sandy or moist or tacky.
Sure. Those kind of feelings that you get from the soil. Yeah. If you're growing on it, it must be healthy, right? It's getting you something. Yeah. All right, great. So, we all have different concepts and relationships when it comes to our soil, the ground that we're working. And there is an official definition from the USDA that we're going to be working around. So the USDA defines soil health as a continued capacity for soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So I think I bolded some of the key words here. Living ecosystem, so our soils are alive, right? And they're an ecosystem, so there are multiple components interacting with each other, right? And then sustaining plants, animals, and humans. So what does that look like in action? When we're talking about that, we're talking about how does a soil function, how does a soil act in the environment? So how does a healthy soil function? We're talking about regulating water, sustaining plant and animal life, filtering and buffering potential pollutants, cycling those nutrients, and then providing physical stability and support, right? So your soil is staying in place. So those are some of the functional characteristics of a soil. So how do we figure this out? With different soil properties. So there are three main properties of a soil: the soil's chemical properties, the soil's biological properties, and the soil's physical properties. So there are different ways that we can assess these different areas in order to determine its function in those ways, right? So a healthy soil doesn't have a singular universal look, right? In our minds, and I think in my mind often when I think of a healthy soil, I'm thinking of something rich and dark and black and a lot of those deep, mollisols. But across the US, we have thousands and thousands of soil types, and across the world, right? And that is not to say that one soil is better than another because of how it looks, right? There are so many different ways that soils develop over time that its health or the functionality of that soil is not dependent on how it looks. With that in mind, there are some inherent characteristics of the soils that we farm on or the soils that we work with that we cannot change because of its taxonomy, its origin, right? What's there is kind of what you've got in some considerations. So for example, something like a sandy soil isn't all of a sudden going to turn into a loamy sand no matter how much manure you put on it, or how much compost or how much love and care and you're singing to it at night. It's still going to be a sandy soil. That doesn't mean it's not healthy, right? It doesn't mean that it's not going to provide those functions that we're looking for and it's not going to be a healthy ecosystem. And so when we're thinking about soil health, the name of the game is not comparison to other people. It's an evaluation of yourself over time, or your land, I should say, right? So the goal would be to assess your soils and know how to manage them uniquely. Comparison with myself brings improvement. Comparison with others brings discontent. So that also goes with soils and how we're managing them. So when we're comparing to ourselves over time, when we're comparing how our field is working and functioning and handling those big rains year one of what's getting it versus year 5 of a management practice, that is where we're going to really evaluate what soil health is like on our land, how it's changing. So we're just going to get straight into it. First, we'll be talking about the physical properties of soils, and then we'll get into chemical and biological and relate those back to management, right? And talk about different attributes of how our management influences those different factors of a soil, okay? So physical properties of a soil. Soils can be evaluated in terms of their texture, the structure of the soil, the porosity, the pore space of a soil, the density, temperature, color, and organic matter. So we're mainly going to be talking about these 3 points. These 4 points are very important, but oftentimes are more better evaluated in a lab or can inform other things, right? But this is where we have the most amount of influence when it comes to our management. Organic matter we are going to talk about in terms of how that helps with physical properties and chemical properties, okay? When we think about a soil as well, oftentimes we're thinking about this part, right? The solids. So that mineral matter and the organic matter. When in reality, a soil is also air and water. That pore space is so important to what a soil is in its totality, right? So about half of a soil is air and water. And then the other half is this mineral matter. We only have a small amount of organic matter in there, but small amount makes a big impact, right? That small percentage really influences how our soils operate. But I do want to harp on this point that the porosity is just as important to what's like physically there, that mineral matter. Now this is going to change. How much air we have in our soil, how much water we have in our soil fluctuates depending on the time of the season, depending on what type of soil that you have. But having and realizing that half of soil is pore space, half of soil is water, half of soil is air, also helps in considering how we're managing our soils. So when we're talking about that mineral attribute of soil, we're talking about sand, silt, and clay. On a scale, this is the size of sand, silt, and clay granules in comparison to each other. So sand granules are huge in comparison to something like a clay granule or particle. And this greatly influences, again, how our soils operate. So you figure out, this is a tool that a lot of folks use. It's really not necessary, but I think it's fun. Soil texturing triangle. So if you have something like 50% sand, you'll go on this side, and then you are like, all right, well then how much silt do I have? Let's say you got 30% silt. So you're kind of moving in, oh, I'm reading this wrong. Oh, it's across. So then you got 50% sand is like this. And then you either have, oh man, what am I doing? Anywho, there are different categories within the different makeups. So you have something like a silty clay, and that has a certain percentage of silt in comparison to clay, or like a silt loam. So when you see that language on something like a soil test report or on something like a US Web Soil Survey, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the percentage of these different components as a part of it. So a sandy clay is going to have more clay than a sandy clay loam, right? So things like that. So it's not, just made up and feeling, it's a true percentage of what these different categories are. Okay, so what is the influence of texture on our soil? So something like how water moves through our soils is really dependent on the textures that we have. So like we said, sand is a very large particle, so the pore spaces, those air spaces, are going to also be pretty large in a sand soil. Versus a clay, those particles are much smaller, they're more tightly packed, so there's less space between them. When it comes to water, that means sand, we're having water move very quickly through something like a sand. Something like a clay, that's where we're seeing slower water movement, more water retained on the surface. So those attributes can be inherent, but structure is where we can influence things like how water is moving through our soil, how the soil is functioning in relation to water. So we cannot change the texture of our soil. We can change the structure of our soil, which is another huge factor of soil physical properties. So structure can be improved or destroyed over time. What is soil structure? It's all of these particles, right, like a sand particle, silt particles, all of these different particles in the soil, how they aggregate or how they sit together and form together. So those aggregate, those clumps of how those different particles sit together influence what our inherent limitations or struggles might be. So in something like a sand, we'll have lower water holding capacity inherently because water moves very quickly through it. But if we influence the structure of something like a sand, or we're adding things like organic matter, which we're going to get to, we can improve this limitation. We're not going to completely overcome it. It's going to be something that we have to manage and watch because of the type of soil that we have, right? That's place-based management. That's really considering where we are farming, where we are working. But how we farm, how we do management can help with that. Similar to a clay, we have really high water holding capacity in a clay because of those tight spaces, which can be beneficial, but it can be really difficult to work around if you're just having water sit on a clay soil, right? When we improve our structure, we're also making more room for water to move through. We're making more of that pore space, and that's where we can overcome that natural limitation of our texture by improving our structure. So how do we decrease our soil structure, right? How do we impact our soil structure through our management? That happens through compaction, either at the surface or below the surface that develops over time. Shattering through excessive tillage, so destroying or breaking apart those aggregates over time, and then organic matter depletion. So I do want to say we're going to talk a little bit about tillage, and I am not in one camp of everything has to be no-till all the time or you're doing it wrong, and I'm also not in tillage is the way, the truth, and the life. I think tillage is a tool, and a tool that we should be using judiciously, right? In what circumstances does tillage make sense? And in what ways can I reduce my impact on the soil? If I can take away tillage, then can I, right? Can I get away with something like that? Or do I need to use this tool? So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're exploring what tillage is showing up and doing in our soils first. So first, how do we influence our structure through something like compaction? We, in compacting our soils, are removing the airspace that we talked about earlier, right? Where half of our soils, ideally, is that air and that water fraction. When we are compacting our soils, we are compressing it and reducing the airspace, that pore space, right? And that's where we're having difficulty with water ponding on the surface of a field, roots having a hard time breaking through because we don't have the space anymore when we are compacted. And so this, you can see in a compacted soil, almost like lines that show up, right? Like if you were to dig down and kind of dig a little bit of a pit and have a wall and look at your soil as it's a wall, there's visual cues that you can find in looking at a soil and seeing that compaction when it's really bad. So part of how fields get compacted is when we're out there when it's too wet, which can be really frustrating when you need to get work done, right? Or you need to get stuff planted and time is limited. But in the long run, it can be very detrimental. So in wet soils have an easier time compressing, so then you're removing the space that's typically between them. And a good way of checking, and we'll pass around this soil that I dug up the other day, and it was raining. So a good way to check if something is too wet is kind of getting and it's going to depend on the texture too. The USDA has a nice resource that goes through like every single type of soil, what you're going to see in your hand. But in general, if you're working with a soil and you want to see if it's too wet, you're going to compress it together and you're going to see if it's staining your hand. That's a big one. If you're seeing, it feels wet and you feel moisture kind of still in your hand after you squeeze, like you could squeeze out water, right? And then you're making that really nice ball. Now, just right would be that you see a little bit more crumbliness. There's more of that air in the soil. It's not all water that's sitting there. So this is a good example. I am so sorry to whoever owns this table. And we might get the room a little bit dirty, but try not to spill. But this is a good example of soil that's too wet to go on, to work on. So if you want to squeeze it in your hand, and you'll see, it's staining my hand. It's not coming apart. It's not, there's not that air in there. It's not granulating out. So when we go in with tilling or tilling too much, and this is another thing we have to manage for if tilling is a part of our operation, right? If we're using tillage as a way to manage weeds, for example, then there are ways that we have to manage for the effects of that. So erosion is a big risk when we are tilling or over-tilling. So what happens when we're tilling is we're breaking apart those aggregates. And then they become very small back into their particle form and very easily lost by something like an extreme water event or wind. And so in this circumstance, you're seeing that rutting across the field and that water taking those soil particles away from the field. And we don't have anything to hold this in place, right? There's nothing protecting those soil particles and keeping them there, so we're losing it across our field. So something like no-till can be intimidating. Why do we till? We till to prepare a seed bed. We till to warm up the soil, tilling to manage weeds, right? It's, again, a tool that we use for a lot of reasons, but over time, and I think this is the case that we're seeing a lot now in these field crop systems, is the development of subsoil compaction. So if a tillage tool is continuously going over the soil in the same depth, you don't have that continuous root system that you can get with something like a cover crop in between those cycles. You're not pulling those particles together, you're not recreating those aggregates. So those particles are getting broken up in the lower layer and then compressed as you're smearing across with that tillage implement over time. So over time this becomes a problem, and we can see that with our root systems and how our plant is able to even survive in a soil that it cannot move through, where it doesn't have the space to access deeper into the soil profile or access nutrients or water deeper. So organic matter, like we said earlier, organic matter is a part of soil. And what we consider, so what is organic matter? Organic matter is the plant, animal, and microbial residues in various stages of decomposition. So soil material that is from living organisms. So when we think about organic matter, there is a cycle to organic matter in our soil systems. So we start off with fresh residue, and over time, fresh residue breaks down. We do release some CO2, and as we continue that process, then we get to stabilized organic matter. And so the fresh residues, like in a compost or the leaf litter on the top, get to a point where they're more stable in the system, and they're able to act as that glue, bringing those particles together and adding to the system. So it's a part of our soil processes. It takes time to get there. It takes time to stabilize that organic matter that's going to stay in your soil and act as that. Yes?
How much time does it take to get from active organic matter to stable organic matter?
It depends, right? It depends on the residue that you're using. It depends on the ratio of residues that you're using. It depends on how hot your soil gets. It depends on what type of soil that you have. So there's no great definite number that we can say, like, all right, so after 5 years, you're going to get stable organic matter. It just takes time, is all we know.
But like more than a season.
Right, yes, more than a season is what it's going to take. Yeah. And a lot of those stabilized organic matters, because they're acting as glue or they end up in the center of these aggregates, are protected in our system. So you might hear a lot of talk about carbon crediting, carbon storage, things like that, and paying folks, to adopt certain practices so that we can get more carbon in our system. This is what they're talking about, right? We're talking about stabilizing that organic matter so we have a stable form of carbon in our soils, is what those carbon crediting systems are doing. They're paying folks to protect those stabilized forms of carbon. Okay, any questions so far?
Is it possible to have too much organic matter?
Is it possible to have too much organic matter? The circumstance that I would see in that is if you're farming on something that is like a wetland, right? So those are really, really high organic matter soils. And in some situations in vegetables, those are great, but in others, you're going to run into issues. So in a system like this, organic matter is a huge benefit to us in a lot of ways, right? You're not going to see any issues with like, another thing I would think about is over-fertilizing through something like a composted manure or manure, right? So that is a form of organic matter. That's a form of living material from living organisms. So we can use too much manure as a nutrient source. But overall, organic matter is a benefit to us. And you're not going to necessarily get too much in the system that's going to be detrimental. Now, you can reach a peak, right? So like we said before, there are inherent properties of our soil. So a lot of times we can only get as far as Mother Nature can go. So if we're farming in an ecosystem, in a soil system, where the natural organic matter percentage only sits, or like if you're going out into a forest, it sits around 3%, 4%, you're not going to get much more organic matter than what Mother Nature can do. So just keep that in mind as well as we're maybe pursuing adding organic matter to our system and integrating that. Great. So another thing with tillage is we can deplete our organic matter over time when we till too much. So in this graph, we're seeing that this is a natural prairie system, native organic matter level was about at 100% of what the native grassland organic matter was at. When we started tillage, we very quickly decreased that over time. And this is 25 years after tillage began. There wasn't anything on the land, and then we're starting permanent sod, right? And so then we have a permanent grass, maybe a native grass out there. It's going to take a long time before we get back up to what its original native level was, right? So even in starting this process of keeping roots in the system through a native grass, it takes time. So how is tillage using up organic matter? So oxygen provides energy to that microbial community, and that energy helps the microbial community feed a lot. So then they're starting to consume the organic matter in the system very quickly and use it up very quickly. When if it's not being touched, then they're consuming it more slowly. In this rapid consumption of your organic matter and your residue, nutrients are being quickly released and it can be lost. Now that's a benefit in some situations. If you're tilling and then you're immediately planting, then maybe your plants have it immediately accessible. But again, let's balance those risks with what we're getting out of it, right? And so a lot of the times, people who get maybe a no-till field and then they till it up, it's like, wow, well, I have amazing yields. What are they talking about? I don't see any risks here. That's where we're seeing the benefit, because we're seeing that quick rapid breakdown. And then when soil microbes run out of residue to consume, then they start to die off. So it's that process of being able to feed the community that's there and provide them that continued supply of nutrient and food. And then after tillage, we don't have those aggregates, those structures to protect our organic matter. Soil organic matter is a benefit to our system because it can also increase the container of water that we can hold in our system, right? So soil organic matter provides us more room and opportunity, more space to hold water. So it's like we're getting a bigger container. So on the left here is a soil with more organic matter, right, is our scenario. When we get more water, we have more room to hold it. We have more space from that organic matter to hold that water when we have that addition in our system. And then when we have drought scenarios, our container is bigger, we have more of a reservoir for crops to pull from. So that water is better held in a higher organic matter soil. When we don't have the container, the ability to hold water in our system, that's when we're seeing things like soil or water more easily running off. And then we're seeing crops facing drought more quickly. So that reservoir is being pulled from very rapidly. So how do we improve organic matter? We can, we can improve structure, by adding organic matter. So the decay of that organic matter, like I said, that stable organic matter adds a microbial gum. Those hold those particles together. Those help support the strength of our aggregates. We increase our soils, reducing our soil's limitations in its inherent structure. So when we give a sandy soil more organic matter, it gains those macropores, becomes less droughty, it can hold on to water better. Clay gains those macropores, so it better aerates, right? We have those clay particles pulled together more easily, and we're making room for the pore space for water to move through. And then roots have an easier time penetrating those systems where we have organic matter pulling those particles together and helping develop those aggregates. And then air moves freely. Aeration of roots is, important for plant health, etc. So we're not able to do the slump test because my soil's too wet. But this is a good plug. If you are someone who is interested in educating other folks on soil health, or you're just interested in soil health in general, the Soil Health Nexus is a really great resource for educators and people interested in soil health research. So in addition to their monthly webinars, they have a toolbox of demonstration, educational materials, things of that nature for you to use. So if you're wanting to see the slump test in action on soil that's not too wet for it, or you want to do it yourself, this website is a great resource for folks. And they're specifically based out of the Midwest, so a lot of their stuff is relevant to our region. So that'll be up here if you want to scan that. Now we're getting into chemical properties of the soil. And we're going to be focusing in, and so the chemical properties of a soil can include its nutrient content, its cation exchange capacity, its pH. Again, organic matter influences our chemical properties of the soil. Heavy metals are a part of this conversation as well, and more. So I couldn't list out all of the ways that we evaluate and we look at soil chemistry. But these are the three big ones that we're going to be talking about. So, Chemistry 101, like charges repel, unlike charges attract. Why is that relevant to us? Because our particles are negatively charged. So organic matter is negatively charged and clay is negatively charged. Many of our nutrients, not all, but many of them are positively charged, so we're able to hold them on the surface of these particles. So what's negatively charged, what's positively charged? We have several cations. Those are the positively charged, ammonium is positively charged, potassium, calcium, magnesium. And then we have nutrients that are negatively charged. Why does that matter? These are not going to hold onto our soil easily, so they are more readily lost from our system. So these are nutrients that we have to be very judicious about when we are applying them in order for us to apply them when our plant needs them. So when we're thinking about issues like water quality, what's happening in Lake Erie, what are the nutrients that are affecting that? Phosphorus. Why? It's negatively charged. It's not being held in our soil system. So when we're applying that at the wrong time, we're losing it from our system really quickly, and that's how it's getting into our waterways. So a lot of education and work is also, we'll go over this, about applying it at the right rate, the right time, having the right source or form for that nutrient, things like that. So these are not nutrients of concern. I don't want to scare anybody, but really want to manage those well, right? We don't want to waste money either. So that's something to consider.
So what are like keeping them in the soil? What are the best things for that?
Applying them at the right time in the amount that's needed. Organic matter also helps in, well, I guess it's more to do with our positively charged, right, holding on to the nutrients that are there. Form can also be a big impact, so you can have different forms of a nutrient or a fertilizer, and some of those forms are more slowly released, right? So they have something else, a part of it that slows down how it's released into the system, and so that can be something to watch out for as well and to look for. Yes?
The previous slides that showed clay, what about sand?
Sand does not have a charge that helps with our nutrients, which is why in something like a sandy soil, organic matter is so important in order to improve our nutrient holding capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, at least it's not getting pushed away by the sand, right?
No, it's not getting repelled. It's just not being held either. So it's like, we got to be judicious. I'm not going to go too deep into this because this is a lot of math, but just to consider, how are fertilizer bags labeled? And then also there are some composts that are also labeled this way. We're NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And these numbers are the percentage of that element in the fertilizer. So when you're buying a fertilizer, just be aware of the percentage of the element that you're actually getting. So the rest of what's in that fertilizer is inert material. So it's not necessarily the nutrient that you're looking for. So you got to do some math and make sure that the amount you're applying is the amount that your plant needs because of the percentage that might be in a fertilizer. So something like this, if your plant needs more nitrogen, then a fertilizer like this, which has 12% nitrogen, 12% phosphorus, 12% potassium, might not be your route, right? You might need to find additional forms of the nutrients that your plant needs. So just be aware of that. It takes a little bit of math to know for sure what you're getting, how much you need to apply. So I was mentioning this a little bit before. These pillars are how we are good stewards of our nutrient sources. So we're talking about the right source, so matching your fertilizer to the type and amount that your crop needs. Right rate, so the amount is correct that you're applying so you're not losing it in the system. The right time, so making nutrients available when your crop needs them. And then putting it in the right place. So sometimes it can be really easy to just broadcast something everywhere. But if we're wanting to be considerate and not have to waste a nutrient or really consider our resources, putting it closer to where that plant is going to be within the seed bed, within the furrow, is another pillar of that. So that's a part of right place. So those are the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. So notes on manure. I'm not going to get super deep into this. There are a lot of great people who can talk much more in depth about manure and managing manure. But the big takeaway is not all manure is created equal. And fresh manure is different than composted manure. So those are big things to consider, right? So this was a study of the University of Minnesota, and each of those dots is a different nutrient. So something like a poultry manure is going to have way more nitrogen than phosphorus. And just considering that this is not, also static, right? Like manure in this year is going to maybe look a little bit different than the nutrient amount in manure in another year. So if you can afford it, testing your manure can be really helpful with making sure you're getting that application correct and you're getting that amount correct. Another thing, fresh manure can have higher salt levels and higher amounts of nitrogen that can be in too much burn a plant. So considering that, right, when we're applying fresh manure, maybe that's something that needs to be composted first. And then another thing to think about, will compost manure rapidly mineralizes or loses nitrogen to the air, right? It's a natural process in composting. So composted manure might not contain as much nitrogen as you originally thought it would. Now it is still a nutrient source. That compost manure still has nutrients in it, but it's not as much as a fresh. So just consider that, weigh all of those things when you're doing your nutrient management planning, when you're considering all of that. Also with manure, we're not just getting the nutrients. Manure is an organic form of organic matter. So we're getting all those other benefits of organic matter decomposition into that stabilized form of carbon. So there are other parts of manure that we're getting other than just pure nutrients to think about if you're using it. Oh, and then also thinking about using manure in food safety. So make sure to also keep that in mind when you're applying manure, where you're storing it, things like that. So that's a huge consideration as well when you have manure in your system. Okay, so pH influence is how a lot of how other chemicals behave. It influences a lot of how plants behave as well. So more acid or alkaline soils, that means soils that have a higher pH or a lower pH, can produce toxic concentrations of some elements and deficiency of other elements. So knowing the pH of our soil is also going to be important in how we apply nutrients and then what our expectations are. So if you're applying something and it's not working and you're still deficient on this in your plant, maybe it's something with your pH that's actually not making that nutrient available to your plant. Also, microbial activity is influenced at pH, right? So a lower pH reduces our microbial activity and survival. And so that can be a big impact on our overall soil function. And we'll talk about soil microbes in a little bit. And microbial activity is really important in releasing those nutrients, right? And cycling the organic matter through our system. Nutrient availability, again, if too much, we can cause a toxicity. The plant is getting too much, it's toxic to the plant, or a deficiency, the plant is not getting enough. And then lower pHs can actually make other nutrients move through our system quicker. So something like a calcium, potassium, magnesium can move more quickly through our soils if it's at a lower pH. So there's all sorts of great graphs of this online, but just an example of this, right at a pH of maybe 6.5, we have a lot of our nutrients that are highly available, they're accessible to us, but then as soon as we move into something like a 5.5, or if we're starting off with a soil of a 5.5, we're deficient in many of these nutrients. So we might need to influence our pH first. And we can do that by adding lime, we can do that by adding other things before we can see the responses of the different nutrients that we're adding to the system. So pH is a very important element in how we consider our plan.
You've got 25 minutes.
Great. pH can also influence and maybe inform what we're growing. So let's say you're starting off in a pretty alkaline soil, right? Like you're maybe more closer to 8. Maybe your farm plan isn't so focused on, well, all of a sudden I'm gonna grow blueberries on this more alkaline soil. Maybe we're responding to and planting our crops around the type of soil that we have until we can influence it, or just working with what we have, right? So that can also be a big consideration, right? In working within our soil type, working within what we have available to us. Again, we can change the pH of our soil, and that's totally fine. That's, a process we can do, but just something to consider, right? Like if God's given you a really acidic soil, run with an incredible blueberry sweet potato operation. Don't, why fight it? Okay, note on pH in greenhouses and hoop houses. I'm not an expert in hoop houses and greenhouses, but I did want to bring this up. Now, when we're out in a field and we're getting that rain coming through the soil, we're having nutrients move through soil, we're having salts move through the soil, and so we're getting that distribution more readily. Whereas in a greenhouse system, we're not necessarily washing the soil, so those salts or elements are more readily set in our soil materials, right? So we're not getting the movement. So salts can end up affecting our soil pH over time and our nutrient balance. So if you're growing in a hoop house, you're growing in a greenhouse, you're growing in a potted scenario, and you're wondering why you're seeing nutrient deficiencies all of a sudden, really consider that maybe salt buildup is a factor in that. Jeremy, there's a bald guy running around with a black polo that says MSU on it. He can more readily talk to you about this if that might be a consideration, but there's also resources online. But just something to be aware of, right? Like you still got to watch out for pH as a part of your nutrient equation, even if you are in a greenhouse.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
If you don't know, that's okay. Is it because of the type of water you're using, or is it because it's not coming down hard enough?
You know, I don't think it's, in my very basic understanding of it, I don't think it's a type of water necessarily. Now, you probably, if you're in a greenhouse scenario, you probably should be testing your water, you know, yeah, and getting a softener or treatment, yeah?
I just was going to say, you're going to have more intensity on the fertilizers used, and fertilizers are salts. They're in the form of salts. So literally, the application of fertilizer can be adding salt content to your soils. And you don't have the kind of you call it a water event, raining, heavy rain, whatever you want to say, that is going to leach it beyond the reach of the roots. So I would say, if you're having that problem, I would suggest a change in how you get nutrients to your plants.
Yeah, that's something to consider.
Salt is fertilizer.
Yeah.
Something to consider we not use as much of anyway.
Sure, yeah. Well, there you go. But yeah, I think it's more of a soils thing than it is a water thing when you're dealing with an issue like this. Okay. Any other questions? Great. So a part of being able to manage your fertility plan and your soil chemistry is soil testing. So being sure to test your soils every 2 to 3 years. There's a guide to soil sampling available online. By soil testing, it gives you the basis for what your nutrients need for the type of crops that you're growing. It gives you the idea of what your soil pH is at. It can help you diagnose problems, be responsible with the environment that you're in your applications, et cetera. You can also get organic matter percentages from a soil test. So biological properties of the soil, we're not going to get too in the weeds because a lot of the biological tests that we have available to us are done in a lab. So something like a enzyme activity is not something that we can pull up and do on our farm, but it's really important, and this is a factor of what is influencing our soil's function, what is influencing our nutrient availability and cycling. So factors that influence our soil microbiology / factors that our soil microbiology influences something like carbon, right? How carbon cycles through our system is impacted by microbiology. Organic matter, again, building that stabilized form of organic matter, and then through organic matter, creating more food and supply for our microbial community. Enzyme activity, that's how nutrients are cycled. Earthworms help with the physical development of our soils over time, right? As earthworms move, they're pushing those soil particles together, they're creating those aggregates. Nematodes, very similarly, are smaller worms in our system, and so they are part of the larger ecological landscape of our soils. They add to our nutrient cycling. They help with microbial bodies of concern, so viruses, pathogens. They again also help with that physical movement of particles together, that soil structure. Respiration, so soil organisms breathing, adding carbon to that space. That is a way that we test for microbes, and their activity is how much they're breathing. Fungi and bacteria populations are really important in how our soils function in all these other ways, and nitrogen fixation. So, these are some of the tests and counts that people do to assess a soil biology. So why care about microbes? So I went through a lot of these before. Microbes influence our soil structure and aggregation. They are our toolbox of soil function. So they can help improve soil structure and aggregation. They can improve, they can be plant growth promoters, right? So adding to what plants need in terms of hormone signals or nutrients and things like that. Nutrient availability with that nutrient cycling, nutrient retention in our system, nitrogen fixation, and so building up soil carbon, so moving that carbon, that organic matter through the cycle so that it's stabilized, and then pathogen and pest protection. So the more diverse your community is, the more ability that it is to compete with those pathogens, with those pests, and that's a huge benefit. So adding more microbes, what's the thing about this? Well, the science is still pretty new, right? And it's something to try out on your property if you're interested, but some things to think about. So soil microbes, like soil, are unique. And so something to consider is by first improving your natural microbial community, right? To stabilize that is so important, right? When you add a microbe from a product, is that microbe going to even be able to survive in the soils that you have? So that's huge. Another factor that influences something like adding microbes is our soil pH. Yet again, if we're in those shoulder pHs where where microbial communities cannot survive, is adding them going to be a benefit? Probably not, because we're already in a point where our soils are so acidic that nothing can survive. So that's another consideration. And so it's, you know, we also have a hard time identifying specifically, okay, this microbe can for sure release this nutrient outside of its community, right? A lot of microbial community research is done in labs or it's done in their community settings. And so thinking about different ways that microbes can influence our ecosystem. So I think, in my opinion, and again, this is just mine, maybe a little harder to say for sure you're going to get this amount of nutrient from this microbe. And it's more so about maybe combating soil-borne pathogens, right? What are the other functions that this microbe is doing to my community? Then you're for sure going to get this number, right? So those are things to think about and consider. Test out the product claims directly. Not wanting to discourage anybody testing it out, but just be mindful of how you use them, how they work, and how they operate in a system. Again, like I said, before you buy a brand, how are you supporting the naturally occurring microbes? How are you going to support microbes that you even introduce? Yeah?
Does adding compost, good old-fashioned
Yes.
compost, does that introduce microbes into your soil system?
Absolutely, yes. So from a compost, we're getting the benefit of that organic matter in the system, that stabilized organic matter, so it's gone through the process of decomposing over time, and the microbes that came from any form of that, compost itself. So something like a manure, there are all those gut microbiomes from the animal that we got the manure from that we can readily add through compost back to our system. So that is a huge multi-pronged benefit from a compost or a composted manure. Anything else? Great. Organic matter, I forgot to delete this slide, but we talked a bit about this, but again, biological attributes of the soils add to and help cycle that organic matter. You're providing food through organic matter, etc. And so this is just percentages of it being stabilized versus active, typically what you're seeing in a soil. Okay, now we're getting into the management piece. So building soil health takes time and intentional management. So there are 4 principles of soil health that people typically talk about, and that is minimizing disturbance, maximizing biodiversity, maximizing soil cover, and maximizing living roots. What does that look like on a farm? Minimizing disturbance. How are we doing that? Selective or minimal tillage. So for something like this system, we are directly planting in. We're only disturbing the soil where we're planting. And for small seeds, maybe you're tilling lightly and preparing that seeding strips. For larger seeds and transplant, just planting directly into the residue. Now, in some scenarios, maybe we'll have to build up soil to begin with, right? So I like this lasagna method where you're rotating like a carbon source and then a compost or whatever to just even build up a soil, right? In some circumstances, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of those urban affected soils might be, we might just have to be starting from scratch, right? And that's what we got to do before we, minimize that disturbance. But that carbon source, those cardboard layers or leaf litter or whatever kind of helps protect that. Maximizing biodiversity. So how are we doing that? Adding vegetative and animal diversity. So what does this do? We're feeding the soil and the biology with diverse plants, diverse root systems, and then we're also breaking the green bridge for insects and diseases. That is so important. When we are focused on one family of plants year after year or in the same area, we're making our plants and our crops more vulnerable to the same diseases, the same pests. So rotating out that can really help not only in soil health, but overall crop health. So diverse rotation, cover crops. So in those off-season, planting a crop that is going to help protect our soil, add that diversity from that late fall time over the course of the winter, and then before we get into our planting season in the spring. Including animals if possible. Now I feel like this is a pretty contentious topic, right? There are a lot of people who are saying if you're not incorporating animals in the system, you're not regenerative. I am pretty neutral on that scenario, but I think that we do see something from the animal added to the system and things of that nature. Or, manure is also that element. It's different than animals on the land, but again, that is a way to add diversity to our system through animals. And then making our farm hospitable through pollinators is another thing to think about. Pollinators and other microbial communities. So when we have that diversity of root systems, we're making it more attractive to those ground beetles, those earthworms, things like that. So those are other considerations for diversity, biodiversity and soil health. So these, and I can leave this up here at the end if people want to take a picture. There's all sorts of amazing books on crop rotations that really highlight this. But when we're thinking about adding that biodiversity, it means planting in different families, right? So it's not enough that we're just like, okay, well, I grew tomatoes in this area one year, and let me go and plant peppers. That is still of the same family. They are still being exposed to and vulnerable to those same diseases, those same pests, right? So rotating those families in our systems, either with our crop or our cover crop. Maximizing a living root. What is this doing? It is improving our soil structure. So we have those roots pushing those aggregates together. We are adding organic matter deeper into the soil profile, and then we are helping with infiltration. This is just a schematic from a research study where they found that fields that have cover crops, fields that are perennially covered, are able to add water deeper into their soil profile, hold water for longer. So those roots are doing something really important when we think about water management, water infiltration, things like that. So considering your cover crops and then considering your crop rotation timings so that you're able to keep that soil, give those roots as long as possible in your system. Yes?
So you mentioned like the roots being in the soil. Can you touch a bit more on like root exudates and like, the benefit of not tilling up the cover crop or like that versus, covering the soil with tarps, just like a bit more on that subject.
Yeah, I don't know if tarps and root exudates are directly related, but I can be pretty ignorant in that if they are. But what, roots exudate or release compounds from this. So they're like a glue, they can be like sugars. There are all sorts of things from roots that are being exuded from the plant. So all of those materials that the roots release are beneficial in our microbial community. So our microbial community likes to eat these sugars, these glues, and then the glues are the other things that roots are exudating, help with pulling those particles together into aggregates. They act as glue. Those are also they can be forms of organic matter, right? These different form through root states. So though it is incredibly important when we think of our microbial system, when we think of our soil structure system, and why something like keeping living roots in the soil for as much as possible is really important.
I guess, is that even true, like in winter? How active is the soil in winter? Because I often consider, like, having the ground in cover crop, having the ground in weeds, or having it tarped. Like, what is the beneficial, you know, how to know, like, what the most beneficial practice is?
So I think that it depends on what is growing at the time. So even when a plant is dormant on the surface, and if it is a perennial plant, if it is a winter hardy plant, its roots are still active. And so that's something to consider. But roots decomposing, so even if you're only using like an annual cover crop, it's going to die in the winter, or you're tarping something, like you're wanting to, a lot of people do that as a weed management thing. That decaying root is still important to our system. So I don't think that something like a root exudate is more important than a decaying root for what's being added. But it definitely is different in terms of what our microbial community and what our soil is experiencing. And I don't know if that influences health so drastically, you know? And so there are other parts of the system that you might want to consider. So like weed management, right? What is your crop rotation, right? Are you able to have something that's perennial? Does that make sense for you? Or does it make sense to have an annual crop, but your roots are decaying? You're still having the decaying process of those roots, but it's still important to the system. Yes?
You're right. It's the decaying of the roots that's important. And the root system, if it's left there, just she has that one spot on no-till, leave it alone because it's holding the particles in place over the winter. Right. That's really what it is. And the decay, exactly. And by the way, you haven't talked enough about fungi, if you ask me.
We have a lot to cover. I'm sorry.
When we talk about manure, manure feeds bacteria. I say that again. When the ratio in your soil should be a 1 to 1.5, 1 part bacteria to 1.5 minimum on fungi. 2 is great, and we're not taking care of it when we put in manure. We're not feeding the fungi. You know what's going to feed the fungi? That decomposition you're talking about. And really, that's what tilling mostly destroys is our fungi.
Yeah.
So the exudates when the plant's in activity. They call it also photosynthesis.
But like
so
even in winter, you know, I'm curious like how to leave beds over winter. That's like something.
Leave them alone.
Right, but like with a winter hardy cover crop, or with your plant residue, or with weeds, or tarped, you know, like what the best practice is, or
what would nature do?
Not tarp it. That's for sure.
Yeah, and you're also
with like leaves, you know.
Right. Yeah, and then you're also limiting how much water that you're able to retain during that time of dormancy.
In a hoop house or high tunnel, should one use cover crops during the off season?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not in a potted scenario, right, and you have maybe something else that you're considering or managing when you have pots or, you know, cut flowers or whatever or something like that, and you're planting in the ground in your hoop house, cover crops can still add a huge benefit, right? Like it's adding those roots to the system that are helping our structure. They're adding the chemistry, the fertility naturally by breaking down. They're helping our microbial environment. I think that covers are still very relevant in a hoop house scenario. Okay. Maximizing soil cover. So what does this do? And we'll move pretty quickly. Protecting our soil surface from erosion, and we're adding that slowly decomposing material to the soil. So if you remember the earlier part of our presentation, this was a field that did not have a cover crop. This is after an immediate rain event. And then this is radishes in the fall. And that is a huge difference in terms of how much soil that we're not losing from our system. And you're thinking to yourself, that's not a lot of cover, right? Radishes decompose pretty quickly, but it's enough. So even when we're trying out cover crops, we can tend to get a little discouraged if we don't have this beautiful, lush establishment, but something on the soil is still doing, you know, something to protect it. It's still adding to our root system, right? It's still having something there to protect it. So, you know, in working with cover crops for the first time, don't get discouraged if it's not what you imagine, it's still doing a lot more than nothing. That's for sure. Okay, so I said we were going to talk briefly about this. So a good quote that one of the formal educators who's running around here today, Dean, would often say is, if Mother Nature is having trouble, so will you. So in something like in urban gardening considerations, and you have a plot that looks more like this, right? You're not seeing vegetation everywhere. The vegetation you are seeing is pretty woody. It's pretty, survivalist. Then you too will also have trouble or struggle with getting vegetation established. So what does that look like or mean? Rehabilitation may be necessary. So initial tillage might be required to disturb the urban compaction that we have in our soil systems, and then taking time to rehabilitate it, not cultivating it. So we need that time to build up our structure with those root systems. We need our time to, if you're wanting to build up a layer of soil organic matter by not wanting to go into our soils or plant into our soils because we don't have a layer anymore, you're gonna have time to have that lasagna method decompose. That's gonna take time. And putting in those cover crops, things that aren't gonna be harvested, native vegetation, again, those compost additions, those manure additions, and then carbon-heavy soil cover is also going to go light years in terms of rehabilitating our soil. Again, this is going to take time. So the first year of having a property is not the year for cultivating it if you have a property like this. And even afterwards, it might not be the time to cultivate it. You might not be able to plant into the ground for a while or at all. If you don't have any more of that organic matter layer, then maybe it's going to look more like raised beds. And then we take care of those raised beds, right? That is still soil that we're working with and worth taking care of. Okay, something that I have as a resource, which I think is really great, is this visual assessment of soil health. So there are a lot of really complex soil health tests that you can get, and that's great, feel free to do that. They're very expensive, but what really works is getting on your land and your property and seeing things yourself and seeing how things change over time. So this resource goes through 9 indicators for you to observe. It gives you prompts, and then you rate yourself. The best way to do this is to come back in maybe 2 or 3 years and do the same assessment using your same eyes, same time of year preferably, and seeing how those visual indicators are changing. It gives you the ability to walk your land, and it gives you a prompt to do so. And it also tells you when you should be doing something like this or times to go out again. So after a rain, how is your land handling rain, right? Is it sitting there for days? Is it able to infiltrate it? What does it look like when, plants are growing? Are plants able to get deeply rooted? If you dig up a plant, what do those roots look like? Are they flattening, right? Are those plants just facing a wall there? So anyways, these resources are up front here. Be sure to grab them. And then if you're interested in cover crops, the Midwest Cover Crop Council is a great resource for finding cover crops that are suited to your area and to what time you want to get them in. So are your cover crops, relevant to planting in November, right? If you can only get them in November, like what's going to work for you for planting in November? And then we also have a resource for choosing cover crops for urban farms and gardens. So both options are also here and available.